Hey guys and gals, welcome back this week for another episode of Haunted Gaming. This week we'll be talking about Pokemon Glitchy Red, a very popular Pokemon creepypasta. The story begins like this. A month ago, a player bought a Pokemon Red cartridge off of eBay, so that he could start a new game without messing up, his save file on another cartridge. The player received the cartridge and noticed that it was a bootleg copy due to the irregular sticker and cartridge materials. The player loaded up the game into a Game Boy Advance SP and noticed that there was only one option: New Game. As the player started up, the backlit screen of the GBA SP went out, which was odd since the player notes that his or her Game Boy Advance SP's backlit screen was actually very good. And, it was better than their friends and everything. And as soon as the player switched to a copy of Pokemon Sapphire, the screen began to function normally. The player kept playing through the game, but nothing had happened at all worth noting. As the player kept on playing the game, it was apparent that there were more and more glitches, as if a lot of data was corrupted. Some examples include the graphics around Red, the in-game character, where Red would turn into big colored bars and the game would freeze. This would usually happen as the player would get on a bike while being inside a cave or building. The player was absolutely sure the game was bootleg until when he examined the SNES in the Celadon department store. The player expected that upon inspecting this SNES, Red would say, "Dad would like this," like usual, but instead Red said, "Where is Dad?" The player thought it was just poor translation or something like that, even though the game was apparently an English copy of the game. Regardless, the player took some screenshots and posted them to 4chan. The player then later checked the SNES, and this time it said, "Who created me?" Now the player believed this was the work of some hacker, and the player thought it was awesome. As the player continued on until he reached the Cinnabar and Seafoam Islands, the player noticed that the glitching was getting worse and worse. The map was getting glitched, and sometimes textures would get swapped. The player attempted to get Missing No then, but every time the player attempted to do the Missing No glitch, Missing No would never appear. Later, the player entered Pokemon Mansion, and as soon as the player entered, a text box appeared stating, "Nice try, Red." The player believed the game was edited, and probably referencing as how the player was trying to do the Missing No glitch, but failed. The game froze and then restarted, and when the player loaded up the save file, he was back in the mansion, even though the player didn't save at the location, and saved way before even doing the Missing No glitch. The player played through the mansion, and when the player was done, the player left the mansion and a text box appeared saying, "Ding dong, time's up, your safari game is over." As the player left the mansion, he appeared in Pallet Town, except this time there was no music or anything. And Red said, "This isn't where I'm from, I've been lied to." The player couldn't move Red and decided to fly out of Pallet Town. The player noticed that there was no Pidgeot. No Pidgeot. The player had a Pidgeot, but there wasn't a Pidgeot in its place. Instead, there was a poisoned level 16 Raticate with only 1 point of health left. As the player decided to use the antidote on Raticate, the start menu disappeared, and the player couldn't open it again. The player moved forward a little bit and noticed that Raticate died, and Red had said, "We killed it." The player began to get a little freaked out at this point, and so the player avoided playing the game for about a week, until returning back to it. The player loaded the game and noticed that he or she was still in Pallet Town. The player biked all the way to Viridian City and found that his or her Pidgeot was safely in the PC. The player went to Viridian City Gym and noticed that it wouldn't open despite having the secret key. Red then said, "Everything that happened to me happened because the world let it happen to me. I didn't become a hero on my own. I was manipulated. I never unlocked that door. The door was locked because the game let me in. Everything you do because the game lets you." The player realized that Red was self-aware and wasn't letting the player in. The player opened his start menu and attempted to fly away and went to Lavender Town. As if nothing creepy happens there. As the player left Lavender Town, Red kept saying no, and then the player decided to just fly to Fuchsia City. Upon reaching Fuchsia City, the player was horrified when he noticed that he was in Glitch City. The player checked the start menu and noticed that Finally, there was his Pidgeot and a Kadabra in his party, but they didn't have the moves Fly or Teleport. Instead, they had a move called Cursed. Red then began to speak about how Nintendo took away his legacy. Red meant that they replaced him in Fire Red and demoted him to Final Boss in Gold, Silver, and Crystal. The player turned off his or her game and had a dream where he or she was a Pokemon trainer he was a Pokemon trainer from Pokemon Fire Red and was being chased by a white pale body. The body caught up to the player and eventually ripped the player's chest in half. Sheesh, what's up with these dreams all the time? For the next few days, the player was depressed and kept playing the game and even called in sick at work. The player couldn't stop thinking about what Red kept saying about his legacy. The player later finished Glitchy Red and noticed that in his trainer card, the character sprite for Red was bleeding from the chest, and there was an option called Gone. The player selected this option and the game reset, giving one option this time: New Game. The next couple paragraphs, it wasn't written clearly what game the player was playing now, but I assume it was Soul Silver. The player wanted to get rid of his nightmares and the fear of Red, and wanted to play the game, reach Mount Silver, and take on Red, defeating him once and for all. Before the battle with Red, Red said that this was the place he was left, on a cold cliff with nothing. The battle begun, and Red sent out his Pokemon. Red's Pokemon were dangerously overpowered, such as a level 255 Pikachu, and at least 3 Pokemon that were over level 200. Despite the high levels, Red's Pokemon were not dealing enough damage, and the player was defeating them quite easily. Every time the player defeated a Pokemon, or lost a Pokemon, the game would say the Pokemon died instead of fainted. And each time the player's Pokemon would die, the player in-game would say something dramatic. Don't wrap your head around it yet. The player finally defeated Red, and the game returned to the overworld, and Red was looking at the player. Red pulled out a knife and proceeded to stab the player, but couldn't, as the Pokemon were holding him back. The player talked to Red in-game. Again, don't wrap your head around it yet. The player told Red that he was the main character, and all the fans love him. Red responded to the player by saying thank you, and that he left a gift for the player before fading away in the game. The player was now playing Pokemon Blue and saw the present Red had left. A Mew, and all the starters. The player still plays Glitchy Red, which to this day now plays perfectly. The player's nightmares were gone, and the player could finally live normally once again. Well, long creepypasta, but it was pretty good. Yes, there are some cliches, but this creepypasta reminds me a lot of Ben from Majora's Mask. There are 2 things about this creepypasta that are similar, and those 2 things are, the player directly talking to the haunted character in the game, as well as the game's character, in this case Red, had become self-aware and spoke to the player. None of this is bad, and it's actually done properly. And, despite being a Pokemon creepypasta, it doesn't take the easy way out and connect everything demonic to Lavender Town, or Pokemon Tower, or whatever. Instead, this creepypasta labels Lavender Town as a safe haven from Red throughout the creepypasta, which is something new. This was the best thing about the creepypasta, and it kept me, creeped out. The best thing about this was Red. Since I was always wondering what Red would say next, because he was self-aware, you never knew what he was going to say. The thing I didn't really like about this was the cheesy dialogue near the end. It just felt too cheesy. How the player was telling Red that all his fans love him, and how we'll all remember his legacy. I was laughing with my palm glued to my face when I read that. Finally, the last thing I found weird was the fact that how could the player talk to Red? In the creepypasta,